It's been 8 months since I last slept with the lights off, and it all started with a simple, peeling plastic keycard. That room number 117 felt less like a temporary stay, and more like a carefully baited trap. The moment I inserted the card, and the cheap lock clicked, a profound coldness that had nothing to do with the air conditioning washed over me. I'm a traveling salesman for office supplies, and I've seen hundreds of motel rooms from California to Maine, but this one, nestled somewhere off I-80 in rural Nevada, was different. It didn't just feel old, it felt used up by something that should never have been there. My territory had me driving cross-country, and on this particular night, I pulled into the desert sands in a relic with a sun-bleached sign and a pool that was less water and more green sludge. The check-in was handled by a woman behind a thick, yellowed plexiglass shield who barely looked up. She gave me the key and pointed a chipped nail toward the wing furthest from the highway. Inside, room 117 was the epitome of budget travel. 2 queen beds with polyester spreads, a TV bolted to the dresser, and a window overlooking the empty asphalt lot. I dropped my briefcase and laptop bag, the thud echoing in the strange, dead air of the room. I planned to get 6 hours of sleep and be back on the road by dawn. The first sign that something was off was the mirror. It wasn't cracked, but it had a strange, milky spot, like a thumbprint pressed into the glass from the inside, high up where no one would normally touch. I wiped it, but the discoloration seemed to be beneath the surface. It was a detail I tried to dismiss as poor maintenance. I was scrolling through my emails when the television started cycling channels. Not a full channel change, but a quick, silent flicker from the news to static to a cooking show, then back. I picked up the remote and pressed the power button hard, silencing the box. An hour later, I was trying to fall asleep in the bed closer to the door. The traffic noise outside had died down to almost nothing. That's when the scratching started. It wasn't the sound of mice in the walls. It was too precise, too measured. It came from the wall shared with the room next door, 118, and it sounded like someone dragging a single, long fingernail across the wallpaper, slow and deliberate, a single pass every few minutes. I eventually knocked on the wall and yelled, "Hey, keep it down, please." The scratching stopped instantly. I figured I had annoyed a late-night traveler, but the next sound was worse, a faint, wet sniffing from directly under the air conditioning unit near the window. It sounded deep and labored, like an animal or a person struggling to draw a breath. I held my own breath, listening hard, and the sniffing continued for perhaps a minute, then faded. By this point, sleep was impossible. I lay there, heart pounding, listening for any repetition. Around 3 a.m., as the room was completely silent and cast in the pale orange glow of the parking lot light, I saw movement, not in the room itself, but reflected in that strange, milky spot on the mirror. A shape, tall and thin, stood just at the periphery of my vision, at the foot of the other bed. It was indistinct, but it wasn't a shadow. It was something. I whipped my head around to look, but nothing was there. The room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the milky spot was gone. In its place, the condensation of a single, slow droplet tracked down the glass from top to bottom, like a tear. I bolted upright, grabbing my phone and shining the flashlight beam toward the foot of the second bed. Nothing but the polyester bedspread. I began to sweat. I started checking the room, the bathroom, the closet, the door chain, but it was all locked and normal. I went back to the bed, phone still clutched in my hand, and tried to rationalize. Fatigue, a bad dinner, the isolation. I closed my eyes and tried to force myself to breathe. The moment my eyes were shut, I heard the keycard slot near the door chirp once, a sound the lock makes when a key is successfully read, but the door chain was still on. Then it chirped again, and again, slowly, rhythmically. The lock kept engaging and disengaging. Click chirp, as if someone was patiently standing outside. repeatedly trying to enter the room, even though they knew the chain was set. The rhythm of the lock mechanism became a frantic, terrifying pulse. I knew, with absolute certainty, that whatever was on the other side of that cheap wooden door was not a person who had the wrong room. The attempts at entry became more aggressive. Not just the electronic chirp, but a rattling of the doorknob, a forceful, impatient jiggle. I snatched my laptop and my phone, my briefcase forgotten, and dove into the bathroom, slamming the flimsy door and locking it. I stood on the toilet seat, pressing myself against the cool, tile ceiling, trying to be as small and silent as possible. The heavy, insistent jiggling and rattling stopped instantly. For a single, horrifying second, there was total silence. Then, a voice, a whisper so dry and close it felt like it was inhaled directly into my ear, filtered through the thin bathroom ventilation fan. It wasn't loud, but it was deep and gravelly, the sound of dust being spoken. You shouldn't have seen the mirror. I didn't wait. I stayed perfectly still until I heard the distinct sound of the plastic keycard being slid back into its reader, followed by the electronic clunk of the lock disengaging. Then the sound of the door slowly, heavily swinging open. I heard heavy, wet footsteps cross the main room, pause briefly at the foot of my bed, and then continue directly toward the bathroom door. I heard the knob slowly turn, followed by a heavy push against the locked wood. I squeezed my eyes shut, preparing for the splintering wood, but the door held. Then, the silence returned, heavier and more complete than before, only broken by the faint sound of the traffic outside, slowly picking up pace as morning approached. I waited until the first sliver of weak, gray dawn light bled through the bathroom window before I crept out. The motel room door was ajar, the chain hanging limp. My briefcase was overturned, and scattered across the carpet was every single one of my office supply samples, pen, pads, highlighters, all neatly laid out in a perfect, unsettling circle, centered on the milky spot from the mirror, which had now fully returned, larger and darker. I left the laptop, the phone, the keys, and the job. I ran out the door, got in my car, and drove straight east until the sun was high in the sky. To this day, I can still hear that dry, quiet voice whenever a lock clicks a certain way. I never called the company. I never checked my bank account, and I never spent another night in a motel. The thing about the Three Palms Motel in rural Louisiana was that it had history. The kind that smelled like mold and regret. We weren't there for a vacation. We were there for the money. My crew, and I myself, a photographer named Marcus, and an audio guy, Pete, had booked the entire bottom floor for a week. We were ghost hunters, or rather, skeptics, who filmed high-production paranormal investigations for a major streaming service. We debunked far more than we confirmed, but the goal was the atmosphere, the audience's hunger for the unknown. This motel, built in the 1950s, on what was rumored to be the site of a mass grave from a forgotten swamp fever outbreak, was supposed to be our masterpiece of debunking. We had set up our base of operations in room 104, a space barely bigger than a walk-in closet, with 2 single beds and a persistent smell of chlorine and decay. We spent the first day setting up miles of infrared cable, thermal cameras, and electromagnetic field detectors across the wing. The key location was the back corner room, 110, which the locals claimed had been sealed off for 2 decades after a series of incidents. The motel owner, a stoic man named Roy, had reluctantly given us the key, but his eyes held a strange, sad warning. "Don't open the door until sunrise," he'd said, and no further explanation was offered. We had a professional mandate to enter at midnight. The normalcy we established was our routine, checking levels, calibrating equipment, and joking about the stale cigarette smoke clinging to the curtains. but the sense of wrongness was immediate. When we unrolled the cables across the carpet in the hallway, they wouldn't lie straight. They kept curling back, always slightly pointing toward the sealed door of room 110, as if drawn by a subtle, unseen current. As darkness fell over the bayou, the atmosphere outside the motel became thick and silent, save for the occasional, unsettling pop of gas escaping the nearby swamp. We were in room 104, monitoring the feeds, waiting for the clock to hit 12. The cameras in the hallway were showing nothing but the empty, peeling paint. Around 11:30 p.m., the first escalation began with the sound. It was coming from the floor above us, a rhythmic, heavy dragging noise, like something immensely weighty being pulled across bare wood. We checked our paperwork. The second floor was completely vacant, shut down for repairs. We all looked up. Pete was the first to speak. It's got to be the foundation settling, the old plumbing. But the sound wasn't random. It would drag, pause, and then drag again, always toward the far end of the hallway, directly above room 110. Marcus grabbed his camcorder and headed out to the stairwell. But when he opened the door, the sound vanished, replaced by a dense, suffocating silence. He came back pale. "The air up there," he whispered. It felt like breathing water. When we returned to the monitor, the digital clock on the screen for the room 108 hallway camera room 2 doors down from us had suddenly jumped ahead by 32 minutes. But the time on all the other cameras was correct. A temporal glitch we couldn't explain. At midnight, we grabbed our gear and headed toward the notorious room 110. The air in the hallway was noticeably colder, near the door, a temperature drop of almost 15 degrees according to our thermal gun. We inserted the key into the lock of room 110. As the tumbler clicked, the lights in the entire wing, not just our hallway, but the outdoor parking lot lights too, snapped off. Total, suffocating darkness. We switched to infrared. The three of us stood frozen. From inside room 110 we heard a sound, not a dragging, but a series of distinct, heavy drops, like large chunks of meat hitting the wooden floor, 5 or 6 times. Thud, thud, thud. I pushed the door open, the old wood scraping against the carpet. The room was not empty. It was filled floor-to-ceiling with thousands of folded, identical pieces of white laundry, stacked in perfect, neat columns. Not clothing, but squares of fabric, like towels or napkins. In the center of the room, standing atop the highest column, was a figure. It was impossibly tall and gaunt, hunched over the fabric pile. Its skin was the color and texture of dried clay, and its eyes were enormous, black, and wet, reflecting our infrared light like 2 perfect voids. It was slowly, methodically, folding another piece of the white cloth. It didn't look up, but its head cocked slightly, acknowledging our presence. We stood in the doorway, paralyzed, staring at this impossible being in this impossible room of white cloth. Then, the rhythmic folding stopped. The thing extended one long skeletal arm and pointed its index finger, stiff and unnatural, at the floor right in front of us. I looked down, and illuminated only by the faint glow of my camera screen, I saw them, 5 or 6 perfect, red-brown stains, the color of old, dried blood, soaking into the top layer of the clean white cloths, right where the drops had sounded. Marcus screamed, a raw, choking sound, and bolted. Pete stumbled back, dropping his audio recorder. I couldn't move, my eyes locked on the clay-skinned figure. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the rapid, gasping breath I realized was my own. The creature in the pile of laundry made no sound. It simply turned its head, slowly, until those massive black eyes were fixed on mine. The profound ancient sadness I saw in those eyes was worse than any aggression. It wasn't menacing us, it was simply waiting. As I finally found the strength to turn and run, stumbling out of the room, I heard the door click shut behind me. The lights in the entire motel wing flickered back on instantly. I caught up to my crew, who were already tearing down the cables in a panicked frenzy. We left everything else, all the cameras, the laptops, the evidence inside room 104. We didn't even check out. The last image I saw, before peeling out onto the highway, was the faint, reddish light bleeding from under the sealed door of room 110. I never told the network exactly what we found. The story we aired was just a simple, unconfirmed EMF reading. But every night, I still hear the imagined thud of those wet drops, and I know that whatever lives in that sealed room is still there, patiently folding its endless supply of clean, white cloth, just waiting for the next stain. It started with the smell. Not a bad smell, exactly, but one that was profoundly wrong. The smell of fresh, damp earth, mixed with an overpowering sweetness, like lilies left in a closed room for days. I smelled it the moment I walked into the lobby of the Ponderosa Pines Motor Lodge, a roadside stop deep in the Redwood National Park area of Northern California. I was driving up to Seattle to interview for a new tech job, and had decided to take the scenic route through the giant trees, enjoying the isolation. This motel, advertised vaguely as a historic landmark, looked like a collection of dilapidated, rustic cabins bolted together, surrounded by the kind of imposing, shadowy woods that swallow all light and sound. The woman at the desk, no, older than 20, but with eyes that looked 100, didn't ask for ID or a credit card. She simply handed me a heavy brass key stamped cabin 7 and told me, in a voice that was eerily flat, "The well water's cold. Don't run the shower too long." That unsettling interaction was the first thread pulled. Cabin 7 was small, dark, and smelled powerfully of that sweet, cloying dirt-tan flower scent. It was clearly a single occupancy cabin, with one twin bed pushed into the corner. A small, framed watercolor of the surrounding forest hung crookedly over the bed. I checked the bathroom. The well water was indeed icy and smelled strongly of iron. I told myself the smell was just the humidity and the old wood of the cabin. But as I settled in, I noticed that the light coming through the single, dusty window wasn't just dim, it was strangely fractured, as if the air itself inside the cabin was somehow denser, almost shimmering. The unsettling quiet of the redwoods pressed against the thin walls. I tried to distract myself by unpacking, but every movement felt amplified, intrusive. Then, the sounds began. Faint at first, they seemed to come from the crawl space beneath the floorboards. A soft rhythmic drumming, like knuckles gently tapping wood, only muffled by the earth below. I got down on my hands and knees and pressed my ear to the floor, but the tapping stopped instantly. I stood up, dismissed it as movement in the old structure, and went to turn on the small, ancient television. As I did, I glanced at the watercolor on the wall. I distinctly remember the painting showing a man standing at the edge of the woods, looking away from the cabin. But now, the tiny figure in the painting was turned around. It was still blurry, still a watercolor, but it was facing the cabin, and it was wearing a faded, green shirt that perfectly matched the one I had just taken out of my bag and laid on the bed. My heart began to beat against my ribs like a trapped bird. I backed away slowly, staring at the painting, trying to rationalize a shift in memory or poor light. But as I watched, the figure in the frame seemed to lean slightly forward. The drumming started again, louder this time, not from beneath the floor, but from behind the thin plank wood wall shared with the bathroom. It wasn't the wall of the shower or the toilet. It was the wall directly behind the mirror. The sweet smell of lilies and damp soil was now so intense it made my eyes water. I reached out a trembling hand and touched the crooked frame of the painting. The brass hook holding it was slightly damp. I gripped the frame, intending to rip it off the wall, but as my fingers curled around the molding, the image in the watercolor changed again. The figure was now halfway out of the frame's landscape, his arms stretched toward the foreground, his painted face blurred but unmistakably staring directly at me through the glass, and the green shirt was now a stark, brilliant red. I stumbled back, tripping over my duffel bag, my breath catching in my throat. The muffled drumming behind the mirror was replaced by a quick, scraping sound, like stone on bone. Suddenly, the bathroom light, the one I hadn't turned on, flickered once. I could hear a wet, gulping sound coming from the drain of the sink, a sound that implied something too large was trying to pull itself up the pipe. Paralyzed between the creeping dread behind the mirror and the impossible horror in the drain, I looked toward the door. The heavy brass key for cabin 7, which I had placed on the small, rickety desk, was no longer there. In its place was a single fist-sized clod of fresh black earth. The cloying floral scent was overwhelming now. The figure in the painting was no longer recognizable as human. It was a smear of colors and shapes, pressing hard against the glass, the wood of the frame audibly groaning under the pressure. The only thing distinct was the red splash of its shirt. The scraping behind the mirror stopped. Everything went dead silent. Then, a single, clear drop of water, thick and rust-colored, slid down the surface of the watercolor's glass. Simultaneously, the brass key for cabin 7 was violently flung across the room, hitting the wall opposite me with a deafening, metallic clatter and landing near the foot of the bed. It wasn't thrown from the direction of the desk or the bathroom. It seemed to have been thrown from the center of the room, through the impossible density of the air. I didn't grab the key. I didn't grab my bag. I ran out of the cabin and slammed the door shut, hearing a deep, guttural sigh follow me into the rain-slicked night. I didn't stop running until I hit the black asphalt of the highway. I drove 40 miles before I stopped shaking, leaving the car engine idling the whole time. I didn't look in my rearview mirror once. The next day, I called the company and canceled the interview. I had seen the thing in the picture, its hunger made manifest, and I knew that the Ponderosa Pines Motor Lodge wasn't a stopover. It was where they buried you under a shallow layer of dirt and waited for the woods to claim the rest.